All right. Well, thank you, Mark, for joining me for this quick and down and dirty interview. So let me introduce everyone to Mark Napolitano. Well, first of all, he and I have known each other for a long, long time. But when I was negotiating my very first lease for Pilates in the Grove in 2010,
Wow.
he was the person that was helping me on my side. Now, he is usually on the landlord side. Like you actually negotiate from the landlord perspective. And so I just thought we've been talking with so many businesses about negotiating leases, negotiating terms, personal guarantees, growth, and all that stuff. And sometimes it's a foreign language to us. And I mean, I don't know if your tenants feel that way, but I feel like sometimes I'm like, am I getting screwed in this deal purposely because people don't think that I understand what I'm talking about? So can you want to just give like a brief introduction of who you are and like what
Sure,
you
sure,
do?
sure. So I was born and raised in Miami. I've been in real estate my whole life, 40, going on 41, 42 years. Yes, I'm primarily a landlord, primarily in the warehouse business, which is back in the day was not considered the echelon of real estate, but certainly in today's markets, warehousing with all the e-commerce and COVID and has been the darling of real estate. You know, offices were certainly depressed during, and they've had a hard time rebounding. Multifamilies reaching the overbuilt status, and a lot of refinancing issues because rates have gone up. I've been building and acquiring buildings since the early '80s here. We used to build a lot. We don't anymore. And yes, I am on the landlord side, so I am dealing with tenants, and I am, you know, always on the adversarial side of renewals. Um, but whenever the opportunity arises, as it did with you, I like negotiating and being in the mix against landlords because number one, I learn things from other landlords. And number two, I feel like my in-depth knowledge of terms and conditions of leases and where you can get people to bend and where you can't certainly improves the situation for you for long-term leases. And I think you'll agree we did a good job in your original store, and you know it's proving itself today. On your second store, a little tougher landlord, a little
Yeah.
less. I'll even say less knowledgeable of the market, and that makes it very hard to negotiate with people. One of the hardest things is to negotiate with somebody who, and not derogatorily, but is uneducated about where the market is, where rates are, where the demand and lease up is, because they'll sit and wait it out. And sometimes that's not always the best thing. And if you recognize that early in a negotiation, you know, you have to set your sights realistically, which is the broad theme of everything I'll try and tell you today, is that there has to be some sense of reasonableness in
Mm.
both sides. You can't go in with expectations that I'm going to just crush this landlord, because if it's not a win-win, and I know in a win-win everybody loses, but that's typical of any negotiation. What happens is someone comes in and they want 6 months free rent, they want a ton of money in tenant improvements, they don't want to pay any increases, they want to cap their expenses, they want no security. I mean, you get to a point where you tip it to where the landlord's going to say, I don't, in a good market, I don't really need this in my life, and you're not going to get anywhere. So setting your expectations and setting sort of a range of goals so that, you know, if you don't get your top goal, maybe you get the middle, or sometimes you have to give and get the lower goal. But reasonableness and understanding the market before you go in is always the best way to handle negotiating leases on
Nice.
a particular
Yeah.
basis.
Well, and so that being said, most of us as small business owners, we don't have a ton of leverage when we're negotiating because we're not like a Starbucks. We're not going to cap and space. We're, you know, my recommendation to people is really like your rent for our type of business should be 10 to 12% of your income. If you're at 50% of your income, it's going to be really hard for you to be profitable. So when we're looking at leases, can you give examples, like what is the difference between a gross lease and a triple net, which some people will hear triple net, some people will see like N on their lease, and some people don't understand
Okay.
what that means.
So broad spectrum of that, not necessarily cut in stone either on the gross or the net basis. Net is less taxes, insurance, and maintenance of the building. Those can even be as broad as the tenant is 100% responsible for everything at the building, including roof and foundation. And those are more typical in sort of build to suit. Is the bird messing you up?
No.
Okay. Those are more typical in sort of a build to suit, like for a Wendy's or for a medical clinic that's a freestanding. So net, the landlord is passing through 100% of the expenses for the taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance and or further maintenance and repairs of the building. On the flip side of that is a true absolute gross lease would be that the landlord's absorbing all of that. You have a fixed price. Florida's the only place that you pay sales tax for commercial rents. We're trying to eliminate that. It's been reduced a couple of times, which has been favorable for tenants who have saved 3% or 3.5%, depending on what municipality you're in. It dropped last year twice. I guess when we have a surplus up at the state level, it's mandated that they drop the sales tax on commercial rents. So on a gross lease, everything's sort of included. But even that is a little bit of a hidden misconception, because tenants still have sometimes waste removal. They still have a water and electric bill. They still have repairs and maintenance that they're responsible for. So it's all basically hybrided. Like even on you could have a gross lease that has what's called insurance and tax stops, where you get increased for the increase by your percentage of the overall building for the increase in real estate taxes or insurance. Those are typically my leases. I do have net leases, but most of my leases are industrial growth, which has those stops. So if you moved in the building and the tax was 10,000 and it went to 11,000 the next year, and you're 10% of that, you get a one-time bill for the year. So there's exposure there. That's another common theme of understanding your lease is where is all of your exposures. Typically, a lot of landlords, unless you're in an office building, a lot of landlords will say you're responsible for air conditioning maintenance, repair, and replacement. You're responsible for plumbing repair and replacement. So at some point you have to, which we'll get into a little bit later, but you've got to understand, like, am I responsible if there's a clog 30 feet in the John away from my place, or am I just responsible for repairing the broken toilet or the stopping up within my space? If my electric panel goes bad and breakers are going bad, am I responsible for that, or am I responsible if the breaker breaks in the meter room, which is much further away? So those are all little intricacies, and most leases are very similar, but there are little differences in leases where landlords understand that there's multi-tenants in a building. The demand will be different on certain systems within the building. There's some instances where you have your control of your own AC units. There are some instances where the building has AC and you're not in control. So there's all these nuances between gross and net. But the basis is gross means they sort of roll up all the expenses and it's within your lease, and the increase you get annually is sort of covering the increase in those expenses, which is much higher exposure for the landlord and less exposure for the tenant. And then the flip side is net, where you're paying 100% of every expense that you're incurring at the building and the building's incurring, where there is huge exposure there for tenants.
That's my South Miami lease. And that's like, we got a huge insurance bill at the end. And I was like, what is this? Right. But that's what it is. So speaking of, and
well, to touch on that real quick.
Yeah.
So typically landlords feel like real estate taxes and insurance are uncontrollable expenses. So that it's hard to get them to cap it, because if the insurance or taxes can be capped for commercial, so that's a little less exposure. But the insurance markets in South Florida certainly are ridiculously volatile and go up and down. So those are uncontrollable. What's controllable is what he's paying for his lawn, what he's paying for his maintenance guys, his janitorial. Those sometimes you can get, if you're successful, you can put caps on those on an annual basis in the net. So you're lessening your exposure. I mean,
Can you give
not,
an example of that? Then if I wanted to negotiate that, like you're right, the insurance one is usually the worst one in Florida because it can change, it can swing one way or the other.
They can double
Oh, in a year.
believe it or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. And so if I wanted to say, or somebody out there was like, okay, I have a triple net lease, or this is what I'm negotiating, what would your advice be to just have a discussion with the landlord of putting a cap on certain things, like maybe the CAM or the common area maintenance, right?
Right. So one of the things I think you and I delved into heavily in your South Miami store was which we had a hard time getting from them. What was the list of things that they were going to pass through to you? So
Mhm.
that's always something early on you want, and those are negotiated pretty heavily by larger companies on bigger commercial leases. So there's no reason they can't give you a laundry list of what's going to get passed on to you. And certainly an educated landlord will know that people negotiate that. Now, if you're leasing 1,000 feet in a 500,000 square foot building, you're not going to have much leverage. Whereas if you're leasing 100,000 feet in a five. So again, the nuance is know when to ask for certain things. Certainly the conversation is, hey, your controllable expenses, I need to know that we're going to be capped. I don't want to come in here and everything doubles every year. And then the give is, well, I know your taxes and insurance are uncontrollable, so we're not even going to discuss those. Some people ask for that all the time, and you just can't do it as a landlord. You'll end up being negative cash flow if you don't have that. So,
Right.
but like janitorial, lawn care, parking lot police. I mean, there are things that are
That
on
they'll
that
pass
list.
through. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, mine are different than a retail center mostly. But like, and then to take that a little further, you have capital improvements to property, which are not typically repair and maintenance. So you might want to understand what they're going to define in a lease, which, like if they got to replace air conditioning equipment, if it's a small piece of equipment, they might repair and maintenance it. If it's a large piece of equipment for a chiller for a big building, they may capital expense it, and then that does not come through on your common area maintenance charges.
Right. That's actually a good point to consider. And then also when you're talking about retail, which a lot of people get surprised by this, but they're like, oh, I didn't know that the plumbing was my responsibility. But in a retail space, everything is really pretty much your responsibility. So if in terms of what you said, like, yes, AC, HVAC, plumbing, is there something that is it typical that they will notify you of, like, the air conditioning unit is 5 years old, or you have a guarantee, like, we will replace the AC or fix it in 2 years? Like, is there something that you should be looking for in the lease in terms of the landlord telling you how well the air conditioning is working, or like how old it is?
So typically there's a maintenance and repair paragraph, usually pretty lengthy, usually describes who's responsible for what. We typically have, because certainly air conditioning systems in these types of leases where the tenants are responsible are always a big issue. Tenants are responsible for maintaining them because they're putting the daily use on. We inspect them and service them and make sure and we have a report that says this unit's a year old or this unit's 20 years old. If it's 20 years old, we typically build some language into the lease so that there's sort of a horizon on the repair. Hey, if you're going to sign a 5-year deal and you make it 2.5 or 3 years with that AC and then it goes kaput, I might not be willing to repair or replace it. If you sign a 5-year and it goes kaput in the first year or two, we might replace it, or we might schedule it so that every year is 20% of the value. So initially the landlords were 100% the first year, 80%, 60%, and we sort of share in that cost. Because you are using it, you are putting, wear and tear on it. Not you, but some tenants never spend a dime to change
Right.
filters and have it serviced and cleaned and make sure everything's working properly. And that certainly extends the life of the unit. So inspections, this was something I was going to bring up with something else, but inspections for you moving into a space are not a bad thing. It's not really common in a commercial space like a home that you're buying, but it's not a bad thing to have somebody come and look and make sure the electrical panels are up to date, or make sure that there's no issues with them, or to just take a look at the plumbing. You're not so much on septic tanks anymore, but that was a big problem back in the day because septic tanks clog very regularly. But sewers, it's not as much of a problem. Now, getting back to what you asked a little earlier, like most of the time tenants are responsible to the source of where they're getting their service from. So if it's a waste line for bathrooms, you're really kind of responsible for that waistline until it dumps either into the sewer.
Right.
Now, a lot of older buildings had like a confluence of 4 or 5 bays that came to a Y, and then that Y gets clogged, and that's a nightmare because you don't know who did it, how they did it, and the landlords typically, blame somebody and try and get
And then
that.
everyone's blaming the other person,
Right,
and
which I think you had also.
Yes.
But we're not a typical person in that sense. We just get something fixed and then we try and figure it out later. Like we tend to be a little more service oriented than probably some landlords who don't do it every day and it's part of their business. And, we manage all of our own stuff. So we feel like it's better to have that taken care of and not deal with it and just move on. Now, if I find constantly if I have a hair weaver and it's constantly hair, then we kind of know and we'll put the expense back.
So let me ask you this. On the flip side, when you're saying the landlord might say to you, hey, you signed a 5-year lease, the air conditioning is going kaput, I don't really want to replace it. On the flip side, as a tenant, and I've had to replace 2 ACs in both of my units, could I go to my landlord and say, hey, the AC's done. I recognize that it's my responsibility to repair it, but I only have 1 more year left on my lease. I don't want to put a whole new thing unless you're going to give me like 2 more options on my lease. That's fair to go back to them and say the same thing, correct?
So yes, so that comes up quite a bit in leases where someone will take a 5-year with like a 5-year option. It's 10 years down the road. Units today, the old days, units lasted 15 or 20 years. Today, if you get 10 or 12 years out of them, you're being very lucky. So that comes up to where, hey, in the last year of the deal, after 9 years, I'm in the 10th year. I'm going to give away all my secrets here, but
that's your point. None of your clients are listening to my podcast. Don't worry. I promise you.
I'll get a call tomorrow and they'll be, but like, the last year of the lease, like we're going to replace it, but we're not going to be responsible for 100% of the cost, So those are all conversations you have. Again, later in the questioning, when you get all done with this, you got to look at everything. Like, am I giving you that AC clause? Am I giving you the caps? Am I giving you free rent? Like, you have to realize that every economical situation that we create that pushes back on the landlord, you're not going to maybe end up getting a rate that's important to you or limited increases, or so you have to sort of weigh the good with the bad. So if you move into a space and a unit's 10 or 15 years old, certainly that's something that's important. If if you move into a space and they just renovated and it's brand new air conditioning, you're going to get 10, 12 years out of it, becomes less important.
Right.
So
So when you're looking, so let's go back then to like, we're negotiating a lease. We're looking for a new space. People are out here looking for a new space, right? What are, in your case, if you were advising me, right, what were the most important things I'm looking at? I'm thinking the terms of the lease, like number of years, options, obviously the rent amount. What are things that you're like are the most important? Now, yes, you have the AC and all that stuff, but what are the main things that people should be looking at?
so you have to set some guidelines for yourself. Are you if you're an ongoing concern and you've got 5 Pilates studios and you think that at some point you're going to build this great business and you're going to exit the business, or you're going to build this great business and hold on to it, and this is your life plan. Those are those are thoughts that you have to have, because you might not want a 5-year initial deal because you're going into a location that you're not sure about, and 3 years. But then on the flip side of that, that leaves exposure. I mean, you generally get an option term, but the shorter the term, the more exposure to market rates you have. Now that's like playing the stock market. If in 6 years I think rates are going to be much higher, or 6 years rates are going to be much lower, we're certainly riding a crest of high rates, high rental rates right now. The markets are slowing a bit. The election's coming. Rates are still up a little bit. They may cut them tomorrow. So you sort of have to understand where the economy is at in the real estate cycle. Retail, certainly coming out of COVID, was recovered and has recovered well. We're in South Florida, which is a completely different market than a lot of other places in the country. We've had a robust influx of other states here, which have driven rates through the roof. So to answer your question, certainly rental rate is the first thing you're looking at. The way they are going to increase your rent and the exposure to other expenses. Most retail leases are net, so net. So you have to look at those CAM expenses. Then you have to look at the amount of build out you have to do. Are you moving in and you're going to be a doctor and you need 7 offices and the landlord's doing that for you, or you're doing it yourself? It's all sort of a sliding scale for the dollars. Like if the landlord's doing more for you, dollars out of pocket, it's going to be harder for him to come off his rate harder. It's going to be harder for him to give up those increases, so again, you're sort of looking at the big picture and saying, like, I'd rather have the free rent and a better rate, and I'll do some of the improvements myself, so that going forward, I have less of a basis in the space. And then you get into situations where you're going to go into an area like, let's say, you're moving into Merrick Mall down there.
Yeah.
They're not going to be as flexible as if you move to a 3 blocks away from there on a side street in the Gables, and somebody's got 4 empty stores. So again, we go back to the reality and the reasonableness of understanding what you're getting and what your landlord can do for you. So
what makes a landlord decide, just from your side, if they're going to give tenant improvements or not?
Well, I think it's market driven. So in the warehouse end, there are institutional warehouse people who give a lot of TI because they're signing 5 and 10-year deals. They're getting multinational or international companies to sign leases for 30, 40, 100, 200, 300,000 square feet. So that capital expense that they've got is already built into their rental model. Whereas, I have a shopping center that we manage on 167th Street in North Miami Beach, where rental rates are certainly less than, let's say, the malls. So I really can't afford to spend a lot of tenant improvement. So we might give up free, like if I had a national chiropractic chain come to that center and say, I need 1,500 feet, but I got to build a space out. I'm most likely going to give them free time to get it done, let
Makes
them go
sense.
through the process, pull the permits. So
So
it's
do
a
you
very,
think from a landlord perspective, an abatement, so an abatement for those of you that don't know is like free rent, is that easier to negotiate sometimes than capital improvements, than tenant improvements?
if you have heavy capital improvements, I would say yes. I would,
Okay.
but again, it depends on the quality and the class of property you're moving into, because there are companies, real estate companies, that are driven by their market value of their real estate because they leverage it and they use those leverage funds to either improve or to go buy other
Other stuff.
properties. So typically the institutional guys want the best rates on their end and want to increase the value of their buildings so that they can refinance and get financing and not ever have issues. So where you find a lot of, I'll call mom and pop owners like we are, I'm not so concerned with that because I'm not really a trader I don't really sell a lot of stuff. I don't worry about the financing. So I might be willing to cut a little leaner deal and not spend money out of my pocket and give maybe an extra month or two,
Makes sense.
and then get my rate and have it and not spend the money. So
Yeah.
it, I mean, I'm not trying to avoid the real answer, but everything is
No,
so
but that's
site
you're giving an
specific.
idea of like where a landlord is coming from.
Right,
Like it
right,
could
right.
be one way or the other. But at the very least, it's worth a conversation. Would you agree? Like at the very least, it's worth a conversation.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yeah. I mean,
The
you
worst that'll happen is you say no. I
right.
mean, you don't
Well,
get anything if you don't
and
ask.
well, good that you brought that up because there's a few ways to negotiate things. I find it, and this is just words of wisdom. I find it most frustrating when I have a tenant who comes to me and seems very interested, and I think we're making a deal, and they come to me with 3 or 4 things that they want to negotiate, whether it be rent or free rent or improvements or trying to cap expenses or whatever. I find it super frustrating when you think you have a deal in front of you and you're negotiating 3 or 4 things, and then you get through with that, and then the tenant comes back and says, "Oh, well, I need this too, and I need that
I,
too."
that's good
Now,
advice.
now, the flip side of that is that's actually a pretty good tactic because now you guys are deeper into the
You're
negotiations.
invested.
Neither party wants to walk. It's a good tactic, but I find it frustrating, especially, my rents are not retail rents or office rents, so I have less of a markup to my buildings than those types of rental rates. But again, I think the more even keeled and the more upfront and the more, now that can backfire because the landlord will say, "Oh, I'm going to take advantage of this person. They're inexperienced," but that's maybe not the place you want to go then.
Right.
It's a
So then,
relationship.
yeah, 100%. There's definitely their
You're tied
relationship.
together for as long as the term, and there's really not many ways out.
Yeah. So what are some, and I'm sure you've seen crazy stuff. Like, what would be some red flags for tenants of like, this may not be a place, even if you love the place, this may not be the landlord you want to build a relationship with? Are there red flags of things that landlords, shady landlords would do?
I would tell you, as you and I discussed before the podcast, when you get into a situation where you have landlords who maybe are not quote unquote professional landlords where it's their business. Maybe the family owns a few pieces of real estate and they kind of manage it themselves. And not again, not to be derogatory, but dealing with an uneducated landlord about the market and what's realistic and what they should do for you and what they shouldn't do for you is a very difficult haul. Um, when a landlord is in tune with the market and he knows it's slowing or it's gaining momentum, maybe that's tougher to make a deal, but you find that when someone is educated on the landlord side of where the market is, what their property really is worth, it makes it easier for tenants to sort of meet the goals of what they're trying to do with an educated landlord. Whereas somebody who lives in Michigan who owns 2 retail centers here and thinks Florida is on fire when maybe the market is slowing, it just makes it more difficult.
Right.
Certainly you want professionalism out of them. You want to make an appointment. You want them to show. You don't want them to call you and say, oh, I couldn't make it. I'm sending my cousin or my secretary or whatever. You want face to face. You certainly want to walk the property and see if there's deferred maintenance. You want to see how accessible the landlord is. And then you want to, a lot of deals go off either a lease term sheet or an offer sheet or a letter of intent. You want to see how professional that is. You want to see how detailed that is with discussing the common area maintenance, the CAM, or expenses or increases. If you feel like they're sort of not giving you the information that you're asking for, to me, that's a red flag, because I think when you get the lease, you're going to see things that you probably are not going to want to live with.
Right.
Out of our experience together, we had a landlord who was hard pressed to even answer questions and or deal with. And then when we finally got the lease, we got the lease with about 15% of the verbiage from another deal that didn't apply to our deal. And it
I
took us a
remember.
long
Oh my
time to
God.
get that rectified.
I remember that. Yeah.
And that did not end great, because they wouldn't take care of the things they should have taken care of at the inception of the deal. So now in
That should have
hindsight,
been a
let's
red
say you're
flag.
2 years, right? So now later you find out that that's exactly how they would be as an owner and a manager. So
So from a business perspective, you're the same thing now I've learned too. It's like we as a business, right? This is a business we're going into. We have to be prepared to walk away because we're seeing these red flags,
yes,
right? Because it only gets worse. Usually, if they're showing you their cards at the beginning that this is not great, like usually it just gets worse.
that's correct.
Correct.
I mean, I always tell people it's sort of like buying a car. You buy a car, which is a common thread among conversations. You buy a car once every 3 to 5 years, 6 years, whatever it is. The sales guy's selling 20 or 40 or 50 cars a month. They are always going to be able to do better for themselves than you will as buying the car. That's the same thing with landlords. Landlords are leasing their space all day long. They know what they can give. They know what they can't give. But if you get that first taste in your mouth that, this guy or this person is not really what I want to be tied to,
Mhm.
that's an intuition that maybe you got to be able to walk. Like when you're
Yeah.
buying a car, sometimes you got to be able to walk and go find someplace else. I know it's time consuming. I know it's not easy. South Florida's been on a robust rebound since COVID, so it's hard to find space. But sometimes it's better to walk and not get yourself in a situation where 2 years or 3 years down the road, you have this wonderful business there and you're just dying because they won't fix the roof leaks. They won't fix the air conditioner. They're charging you all kinds of things that you never thought you're going to get charged.
Yeah.
So that's, walking is not a bad thing. It's hard, but sometimes you got to walk.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't give you this question, but it just popped into my head.
Okay.
Can we discuss slightly like personal guarantees?
Sure. So, when a landlord's going to spend a lot of money to put you in, or you're going to have a very favorable deal, let's say it's space that's been sitting around or whatever, personal guarantees are I won't say they're the norm, but if a landlord's going to spend $100,000 to put you in, he's going to want to make sure that he's going to get paid back. I don't typically deal in a lot of PGs, personal guarantees on leases. We don't spend a ton of money to put people in. Warehouse leases are not really used, that's not really a vehicle that's used. On the retail end, when you're spending money, you want to make sure that you're going to get paid back, or at least you're going to have income for a certain period of time. Typically, smaller retail leases are 3 years, 3-year option. But if the tenant moves out after 3, you spend a lot of money. There's all kinds of ways to carve that out. Like the air conditioning, we can diminish it over the time. If it's a 5-year deal, it's 100% the first year. Maybe after 2 years, it drops to 75%. You can sort of negotiate your way through all the terms and conditions of that. The other thing is there's a lot of nuances and technicalities to personal guarantees. you have a corporation that's signing the lease, and then you have a person who's signing the guarantee. Do you have the husband and wife signing it? Do you have just the husband signing it? Do you just have the wife signing it? There's nuances that your lawyers can sort of help you through. But yeah, you can negotiate those terms also. And I think you and I went through that once before also.
Yeah. They are now, at least in the Miami area, personal guarantees for even small commercial spaces are pretty much the norm.
Okay.
I was able to negotiate out of a personal guarantee in South Miami with the addition of like extra security deposits. And I was like, we'll give extra security deposits and they'll come off the first month of every new term through the end. Cause I was like, I don't
Right.
want to be on the hook for a personal guarantee coming out of COVID. In New York, they have something that's called like the good guy clause that has something to do with what the landlord is responsible for. But most people down here too is like they're not even putting that much money into the space and then they want personal guarantees. So
I think that's a product of South Florida and the
people leaving and
failure rate of
of
tenants
businesses.
in
Yeah.
retail spaces. Um,
Can you
I would
explain what would happen? Like what is that if I'm signing a personal guarantee, right? What am I signing? Like what's the process that
you're guaranteeing the performance of the lease for the term
okay.
of the lease. So if you sign a 3-year lease at 100,000 a year, you're guaranteeing $300,000 worth of payback to the landlord.
So if I close or go out of business or something happens, they can come after me or they will come after me personally to Krista Gurka to pay back the rest of the term. That's basically
Correct.
what we're signing.
Correct. But there is an obligation in the state of landlords to mitigate their damages. Let's say you move into a new, really hip place in the Crossroads in South Miami, and it's a brand new shopping center, and it's just there, you can't get space in there, and you're lucky and you open and they have you sign a PG, and after a year, for whatever reason, you have to close up. You got 2 years left. So let's say you have 200,000 of exposure. And the day you move out, they release the place at a better rate and all the expense. Now they can charge expenses and commissions and all those things. So that's a hard threshold to hit. But let's say they don't lose a dime and they sign it the next day. They typically do not have damages. So
Okay.
it would relinquish your obligations because they have released. Now, if it sits for 6 months and then they release it, well, okay, now you've diminished the 2 years to 6 months. So
Got it.
there is a mandatory obligation of landlords to try and mitigate the exposure of the dollar damages that happen when somebody moves out of a space.
Right. So
Sometimes,
the theory would be if you rented it to somebody else, you can't come after me because you're for double dipping, basically.
right, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So
Now, I mean, the other side of that is you also have most leases say you can't sublet or sublease the space without approval of the landlord. There's a reasonable threshold in the state also that the landlord has to be reasonable in who they, that the approval for you to release the place. Typically you might stay on the hook for that, but if you made a deal with a good tenant and they're willing to take over the space and pay it as a sublessee, then that also diminishes your exposure because every month that rent gets paid, you've got less of an obligation to the landlord.
right. That just brought up another really quick question for me too when you were talking about sublet. What about reassignment? So let's say I sell Pilates in the Grove. Can I negotiate in my lease when I'm setting it up? Should I look that the lease is reassignable or is that a typical language in the lease? You know, how can I protect
A
myself?
typical commercial lease will have assignment and subletting within the lease. So
That
all you've
has to
got to
be
do,
approved or it can be like automatic.
well, it depends. Sometimes the paragraphs are set up to where if you sell your business and more than 50% of the stock trades and you're out, that they have the right to step in and absorb the lease. And then you're selling the business at that point.
Mhm.
Now, if you are going out of business and you need to assign the lease to somebody new coming in to reduce your exposure, that's something more that the landlord's going to have a hand in.
Mhm.
You know, if you're a Pilates studio and then, you know, it's going to be a bar where they're going to serve drinks at a counter outside, and the guy's like, I just don't want that. I got a, you know, a kids tutoring store next. I
Yeah.
mean, that's not unreasonable that he doesn't want a liquor establishment next to a tutoring school. So, but most leases have that language, and you certainly can read through it and certainly, you know, trim it to where it might help you. But the most important thing is it says, you know, there that you can't assign without reasonable approval of the landlord. So that's a standard that's set, but a lot of people add that back into the lease. But most leases are going to have that in there. You're going to have to read through it and understand, like if you sell your business, it's a different trigger than if you just need to
Right.
assign it because you're moving on or the
Yeah.
business is closing.
What if the landlord sells the building? What happens to my lease?
Your lease stays fully intact.
Mhm.
Your taxes go way up. Your real estate tax pass-through is going to go way up because there's going to be a reassessment of the building based, you know, especially for older buildings that people have had for a while and that haven't traded, you know, and the taxes are sort of at a certain level. The resale, once it closes, is going to get a reassessment the following
Mhm.
year because it's been a change of ownership. So you can expect a large real estate tax increase, whether you're on a gross lease with stops or you're on a net lease where you're paying 100% of your portion of the taxes.
Right. But they can't say they're gonna then knock down the building. If I have a lease.
No. As long as you're in good standing, not in
Mhm.
default, your lease would prevent that. Now they
Got
can
it.
certainly come to you and offer to buy you out,
Mhm.
and some people make very good money getting bought out of deals. So so bringing that up, what the trigger would be for you is if, okay, you've been in a place for 5 years or 10 years, you're sort of running out of options. You don't have a new option. You want to renew. You start calling the landlord. They start pushing you off, and you talk to your neighbor, and your neighbor's lease expired 6 months ago, and they put them on a month to month. That's certainly a tell that they're trying
Right.
to empty the building for redevelopment, or
Mhm.
maybe they want to, you know, get rid of everybody and sort of do a major renovation and then, you know, raise the rents and bring people back in. But
Yeah.
you know, if you're having a hard time getting a renewal offer or a renewal option out of your landlord once your contracted options are done, and that's kind of the theme with your neighbors, then that's a good tell that the building's going to be
Yeah.
redeveloped.
Okay, last question, and I didn't give you this one, but now I just brought up a thing. Your advice from a landlord perspective, okay? Say, I mean, we all went through this with COVID. Basically, the world shut down. If I'm a business owner and I've been a good tenant and I need help, something's gone sideways in my business, what's your advice in terms of like kind of reaching out to the landlord, asking for some assistance? What are ways that you would suggest a business owner may do that? Now, I'm out. This was kind of in the question of like women business owners. So I will just say there's a little bit of an intimidation factor. This is very stereotypical, but most business owners in boutique fitness are women. Most landlords are men. So is there, the thought is like, oh, they're going to think I'm a weak, that I don't know what I'm doing? Or what's your sense of like, if you're a landlord, someone's having trouble with their business, what's the best way to approach a landlord to say, like, I think I need a little bit of help here?
So this is a long-term play for me. If you're
Okay,
specifically me,
got it.
certainly we went through COVID. Certainly we went through tenants freaking out and thinking the world was coming to an end and sending us emails saying we're not paying rent for the next 6 months because we don't know where the world's at. This starts the first month your rent is due. Like, pay your rent on time. If you're
Mhm.
not going to be on time, call the landlord, say, oh, you know what? I forgot, I'm out of town. I'm out. I'll be back Monday. It's the 3rd. I'll get it out. It's a relationship based answer. If I have a tenant who calls me every time a light bulb is out, every time a door lock breaks, You know, they stuff the toilet. They want me to fix it. They don't service their air conditioners the way they're contracted to. And it's 3 or 4 years down the road and they have a problem. And I send my guy by there and he says, they haven't even changed the filter. The lines are clogged. The panels are off the AC. Those are going to be typically answers that aren't going to be, it's not, my answer to them is not going to be helpful. When I have a tenant who's been with me 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, I have tenants who've been with me over 40 years. They pay their rent. They take care of what the lease says supposed to take care of. You know, our roof leaks. We have people out within 24 hours of the rain stopping. You got to have a relationship with your landlord that you're not always saying, I need this, you need to fix this. It's not my responsibility. I didn't break it. Like, you have to understand that you have certain responsibilities. So when you have that relationship, when you call the landlord and you've been a good tenant, they're going to be more inclined to help you. In today's world, I'm not sure it's a woman and man thing, because we have women tenants and we have men tenants, and, we do treat everybody the same regardless, but we have people that just understand their position as a tenant, and we understand our position as a landlord. Now, during COVID, we had a bunch of people who needed assistance. We offered to help them. Certainly, landlords have expenses daily: mortgages, taxes, insurance, maintenance. There's things that aren't going to stop because a tenant moves out, or COVID hit, or the world comes to. We have those expenses. Whatever percentage they are of the rent, if it's gross lease, it's there more. If it's a net lease, you can kind of understand it. So we had national companies and we had mom and pops. Length of tenure certainly meant more to us than somebody who moved in 6 months earlier, and we did work for them or whatever. But you have to be, we feel like we would rather work with them and get them to be happy, and hopefully come renewal time, they don't move and go somewhere else. That's we like relationships. We like long-term tenants. We offered rent reductions, but with rent reductions, we extended leases. Well, that was kind of a gamble, because if businesses never recovered, they would go out of business. But if somebody was, like, we had one tenant whose lease was coming up within a year. They were a heavy retail user. They shut 1,000 stores nationwide. This was a distribution center for them. And we knew that they were hurting. I had another tenant who was a national guy. I knew his business wasn't hurting. Nothing changed for them during COVID. They wanted relief. We just finally said no, because nothing about your economics. Some people will ask for financials, which will be hard because you had certain financials up until sort of that COVID thing. And then a month or two in, nothing other than your income getting shut off. You didn't really have financials to, like, during the financial crisis, that sort of weared on people over time. So their financial positions changed. But we tried to help those who we felt really needed the help. And we helped them in the sense of giving them some rent relief, but tacking it on with more term, and or coming up with a payment plan that once things went back to normal, I honestly thought that COVID would be 2 or 3 months and it would kind of be gone. Well, certainly it lingered for close to a year.
Yeah.
So, I know I'm not coming up with a really.
No, but what you're saying is basically you're giving good advice. You're like, have a relationship with your landlord, right? Like, pay your rent on time. If there's an issue, say, I forgot. You know what? I got stuck in Europe and I realized that my auto payment's not going out. Like, it'll be there. And don't call them for the light bulb all the time. Like, be a good tenant.
Right.
If that's the case, have the conversation. Like, if you have a struggle that happens, something happens in your life and you need some help, the answer will always be no if you don't ask the question.
Right.
Right.
But
and
again,
then,
you got to be reasonable too. You can't say,
exactly.
I can't pay you for the next 6 months $1, because that's not going to work.
Right. But I think too, like, and the thing with men and women, I think it's in our own mindset, by the way, that I'm going to be intimidated by asking this question, right? Because my thing is like, they're just going to say no. But you could just say, hey, I don't know, this is the way I'm thinking about it. Or if I would do it, I'd say, listen, my husband just passed away. It's been terrible. Like, I'm struggling with the business. I'm not really sure what to do. Can we have a discussion on how, if there's any way you might be able to find some assistance, deferment, something like that, can we meet to discuss?
So I've had that happen, exactly what you just said. And I might be a little different than most, but we like to work through. I mean, what is a landlord's goal? It is to keep his space leased, because every time there's turnover,
It costs
there,
you.
there's expenses, there's vacant space, there's things that come up that you might not have to have dealt with because the tenant was in the space and it wasn't an issue for them. So we always like, look, if it's intimidating to call the big bad landlord, shoot an email, say, hey, I need to talk to you. I got some things going on. Can we talk about the lease? I'm not looking to get out, but I just need some help. And then let the landlord initiate the call back to
Right.
you. We have found that by helping people get through certain times, like we have some tenants who came to us about a year ago, been with us for 20 years. They were struggling. They said, I got to give up half my space. They were in 2 bays. I said, well, I'm really not interested in taking it back. It's probably coming out of the tail end of COVID. They were in a retail business per se. And I said, look, I don't really want to take the space back. I'm not getting a lot of calls. Do me a favor, ride it out through the next couple months. We'll do this, this, and this for you. That came, we did it, we got it back. December came, it's now a year and a half later, their business rebounded and they're still in the space. So the thing that you said earlier, communication is just the better. We like nothing better than to communicate with our tenants.
Mhm.
Like that is to know what they need, to know what they want, to know what they're thinking. There's a reason that I have 20% of my tenants have been with me more than 15 or 20 years.
It's
There's a
amazing.
reason for that.
Mhm.
Now not every landlord's like that. The institutional guys are very cut and dry. They're very binary when it comes to, Xing their value of their buildings and what they have to get on rental rates and what they can give in TI. But the communication is going to help you. Now, not every landlord's going to say yes, but at
Right.
least if you have the conversation,
Yeah.
and you have a good relationship, it's going to make it easier for them to help you. So
Right. That's
maybe you
great.
need to sell them on the fact that if I get through this crisis, I'm going to be with you. And I wouldn't, maybe not offer, say, oh, I'll extend now, but maybe say, oh, if you give me 6 months relief, I'll extend my lease for the 6 months. And then that way, you're getting some extra money at the end or whatever. There's little nuances to all of that. But again, that's where, negotiating your own commercial lease by yourself on a first time basis is very difficult. If you have someone that's there to help you as a professional, it makes it much easier. And then you learn from that, like sort of you being the
Yeah.
model of that. So
Yes. I'm like young grasshopper.
yes.
This was super enlightening. I bet you all my audience that's listening would love that you be their landlord. So I just think you should now open a bunch of retail spaces for Pilates 2 studios to just open up. That should be,
Maybe I'll leave that to the kids who
let Joe do it.
yes,
Joe would love to
absolutely.
like be a landlord to Pilates
Absolutely.
studios. She would
Absolutely.
be great. Well, I really appreciate this, Mark. It was excellent. I appreciate your time and always your help with everything that I've done as
Absolutely.
well. So
All
thank
right.
you so
All
much.
right. Thank you. Take care.